Order. The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, the question New Zealanders will be asking themselves after they heard that is, why then has the government gone early? Why have they gone early? Why have they called an early election? Because from here on, all of the forecasts show that the economic fortunes of the country get worse than they currently are. In other words, this is as good as it gets. This is as good as it gets. 147,000 people unemployed. The overall unemployment rate still 6%. The youth unemployment rate, well, the 15 to 19-year-olds, terrible, 24%. But even the 20 to 24-year-old, which is a more reliable statistic, shows that there are 13% of 20 to 24-year-olds unemployed. There are 74,000 New Zealanders not in education or training. Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, we've got dropping exports. The current government inherited amongst the lowest government debt in the world, and indeed Bill English was good enough at that time to acknowledge that they both inherited amongst the lowest unemployment in the world and amongst the lowest net government debt in the world. And indeed he said that in the face of the global financial crisis and the recession around the world, that, quotes, this is the rainy day that government had been saving for. So it wasn't him, no. National opposed all of the surpluses that Labor ran to leave the books in that good shape. But, Mr. Speaker, since then, we have the gaps widening in New Zealand. We have the gaps widening in New Zealand. It's not just the Labor Party saying that, it's just about everyone. Oh, it's not true. It's not true, says Bill English. Well, I'll quote him, Shamabeel Jacob, the chief economist at the New Zealand Institute for Economic Research, and he says, and I quote, one of the biggest issues of this generation is the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. And the gaps are opening up in New Zealand. They're really big across geographical, race and education lines. And it is true, Mr. English, and you know it's true. And you know that it shows up in things like rising extreme child poverty, the lowest housing home ownership rates in 50 years and still dropping. Not shaking your head now, are you, Mr. English? Because he's shaking your head, denying that home ownership rates are the lowest in 50 years. He complained about the increase in price rises for housing under the Labor government. And it's true that by the time we left office, house prices were higher than we'd wanted. They've since gone up at a higher rate under this government, and from that high base that he complained about, they've gone up another $200,000, so that the average house price in Auckland is a fraction under $700,000 for a house. And as a consequence, the Reserve Bank is jacking up the interest rates for everyone, holding up the New Zealand currency further to the detriment of exports, and as a consequence, we are still losing jobs in our export industries. Mr. Speaker, Bill English came to power promising that he was going to lift exports to 40% of GDP by 2020. Mr. Speaker, when he came to office, exports were 33% of GDP. They're currently now, they've dropped to 29% of GDP, 29%, and the Treasury's own forecast dropped them to 26% of GDP over the next 3 years. No, he didn't mention that figure, Mr. Speaker, because again it just shows the reason they've gone early is that there are imbalances in the economy that have not been fixed. Mr. Speaker, we've got exporters and manufacturers still cutting jobs in the face of an overvalued dollar. Mr. Speaker, we know in the Labor Party that for sustained economic growth that lifts the wages of everyone rather than it all going to the people at the top who benefit from the speculative economy that booms under the National Party. We know in Labor that we need an economy built on a diverse range of sophisticated, job-rich exports, and that's why the Labor Party's policy do just that. Our economic upgrade policies include a universal KiwiSaver scheme. KiwiSaver, of course, was a Labor Party initiative that the National Party opposed, but they now think it's a good idea, but they won't go so far as they have in Australia and have a universal work-based scheme. We know that we need that in New Zealand so that we've got more of our own capital to invest in the productive sector. So having more capital is not the only answer. That capital has to be directed towards the right parts of the economy, and that's why we need a capital gains tax. Bill English, he didn't show last night. He had agreed to come to a debate on the capital gains tax at Victoria University, but he pulled out. He's pulling out of most of the economic debates between now and the election because they don't want to answer the difficult questions about why from here the economy gets worse. Mr. Speaker, we do need a capital gains tax excluding the family home. The international experience is that in America 60% of their capital gains tax is paid by the top 1%. Same in Canada. In Australia, 60% of the capital gains tax is paid by those on incomes more than $180,000. It is a fair tax as well as being economically efficient and pushing investment into the bits of the economy that we want to grow in the Labor Party. That's why we've also got a research and development tax credit to encourage innovation, why we want to encourage investment in the increases in productivity that come from the sophisticated and expensive plant that we want our manufacturers to invest in. And we do that through our accelerated depreciation policies. Mr. Speaker, industry training is important. Kiwi Build's important to building some of those houses we need, especially in Auckland and Christchurch. Mr. Speaker, the overall package that the Labor Party has will transform the New Zealand economy. It will support higher incomes and it will lower inequality. Mr. Speaker, in the housing area, through Kiwi Build, through Universal Kiwi Saver and the variable savings rate, which gives the Reserve Bank another tool other than interest rates to control inflation, through the capital gains tax, through restrictions on overseas ownership of New Zealand land to stop offshore speculation, we'll stabilise the housing market and we'll restore the Kiwi dream of home ownership. Mr. Speaker, the reason the government has gone early is that the results from here get worse. I want to deal with the assertion that we hear so often from the Minister of Finance and from the Prime Minister, because they're so nervous about it, and that's the misrepresentation of where we're at with inequality. We know that the rapid increase in inequality of income from year to year happened in the 1980s and then the 1990s.
It's not happening now,
well, it is actually happening. The only significant increase in income inequality from year to year the most significant occurred during that period. The only significant decrease was through working for families, which was opposed by the national government, and they called it communism by stealth. Well, it is happening now because the statistics that the minister conveniently quotes exclude capital gains. Exclude capital gains. And the other underlying reality here is New Zealand went from being in the best 40% of the countries in the world, the best 30% of the countries in the world, to the worst 40% during that period, at a time when the whole OECD club was getting bad. So New Zealand now has high rates of income inequality, so bad that the consequences of inequality pile up year after year. And you see that in the statistics about home ownership, which is at the lowest rate in 50 years and continuing to get worse. You see it in the fact that luxury car sales are taking off, highest they've ever been, at a time when child poverty, particularly severe child poverty, gets worse and worse. Mr. Speaker, that's the contrast between this party on this side and the National Party. We actually do have a plan for structural change. National governments only ever trim the sails. They tinker otherwise. This government increased GST and dropped income tax rates, especially for the wealthy, in their first term. This term, all they've done is sell off the SOEs. They've done nothing to deal with the underlying imbalances under our economy, nothing to improve savings. The Minister referred to rates of household debt decreasing during the recession, and they did, and they always do. But now household debt is projected to increase again because the imbalances in the economy have not been fixed, and we're not exporting enough to cover the cost of our imports and interest, and as a consequence, New Zealand's debt will go up, and so will the sale of our land and our companies to overseas owners. Mr. Speaker, New Zealand needs the economic reform package that the Labour government, Labour opposition is bringing forward, and it has widespread respect out there. We know from both from a wide range of sources, whether it's the business audiences or it's the union audience. Well, actually, we reduce debt faster than the National Party does under our alternative budget that's already been released.
I call the Honourable Craig Foss.